Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to have you with us once again. This is PAHO's fifth dialogue on research ethics during the pandemic, challenges and lessons to be learned in Latin America and the Caribbean. The theme of this fifth session is assessing the risk versus the benefits of research projects. And we are very pleased to have with us as panelists members of various research ethics committees of the region. I'm Carla Sainz, and I am a regional advisor in bioethics. And once again, it is a pleasure to have you with us during this session. Before we begin our dialogue and introduce the panelists, I would like to give you some brief instructions about using the interpretation channels. Those that speak Spanish will not need interpretation today.
Please go to interpretation, to that globe on the bottom right of on that bottom right tab on the right side, and click on English if you want to listen to the session in English, and make sure you also click mute original audio to ensure that you don't hear the session in both languages, both English and Spanish at the same time. Bueno, una instrucción.
Very well. One more instruction before we get started. You can see on your control panel at the bottom of your screen, you will see Q&A. In order to facilitate our capacity to answer all of your questions, we would like to ask you to post your questions there. Any comments that you have, or any documents that you would like to share with links, please post them in the chat section. That will help us have more order in our discussion today, so we know which remarks are comments and which are questions that we need to pose to our panelists. I think we have another panelist who unfortunately logged in as a participant, and I'd like to ask one of our tech support people to please help us sort that out. So, as I said, this is our fifth and second to last in this series of 6 regional dialogues. We have been fortunate to have enough resources to do these truly regional dialogues, and also enough resources to provide simultaneous interpretation. Today, we were not able to have a colleague with us from Jamaica. That person was not available, but we are very pleased to have panelists participating from the English-speaking Caribbean. And I think that this has been a very good opportunity to make the dialogue Americans, or rather bringing colleagues from both the English-speaking and Spanish-speaking world together. That is to say, bringing our English-speaking Caribbean colleagues together with the Latin American colleagues. Since this is our penultimate session, the next one will be the last one. That will be on December 9th, after the 7th and 8th have been declared holiday in many countries. At the end of the session, we are going to ask everyone to make contributions. I think we have all had the opportunity to learn some lessons, so we would like to hear from you before that final session. I'm going to tell you more about that later. But as regards this session, as I was saying, we will hear the perspective of people who are members of different research ethics committees. And we'll talk about the essential things to bear in mind for the ethics of COVID-19 studies. And it primarily revolves around a risk-benefit analysis. As you know, ensuring a positive risk-benefit analysis is something that all committees do. In all of the studies that we review, we try to ensure that the benefits of the study will outweigh the risks that are involved. And we also all know that the risk-benefit balance may change and vary over the course of the study. And ethics approval is not just a blessing or a canonization that is permanent, but rather this is something that is conducted in light of the most updated evidence that is available. As that evidence changes, however, the ethics evaluation or the ethical acceptability of a study may change. Why would it change? Imagine you might pose a research question, which is the reason the study is being conducted, but then that question is answered by another study, so there is no further benefit to continuing the study. Or it could be that one has identified a certain study design which was methodologically acceptable at the beginning of the study, but as the study is underway because of discoveries elsewhere, that design is no longer ethically acceptable. For example, because the comparator is no longer acceptable, or there's a different comparator, or the placebo, it's no longer ethically responsible to use a placebo. And also there may be information that needs to be shared with the participants in order to ensure a genuine process of informed consent. And this may be information that was not previously available. So in the light of new evidence, in your experience with ethics committees, and I know that I'm not just referring to the panelists regarding this, but also all the participants, we need to review and revise studies and sometimes even suspend or cancel a study, or perhaps say, we might determine that the study continues to be ethically sound based on the evidence that we had. But sometimes things are different within the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And what is different is that processes that are normally carried out with certain calm annual reviews or reviews every certain number of months, now this all needs to be done much more quickly because the entire world is studying the same thing. And the evidence produced is tremendous in volume. So this means there's greater potential for the ethical acceptability of the study to change. For this reason, PAHO has published guidance specifically on the guidance for ethics oversight of COVID-19 research. And I'm going to put the link to this publication in the chat box. And I'm also going to provide links to the list of ethics research, because in case you are not on our mailing list, we want to make sure that you can directly receive from us all of the resources that we have, both PAHO resources, WHO resources, and resources from other partner organizations. So this PAHO guidance for ethics oversight of COVID-19 research gives specific guidance on the process and the content of ethics analysis. In terms of the process, a very important role is played by the investigators. And we lay that out, as well as the role of the committee and the steps to be followed in terms of continuing the study, modifying the study, suspending a study, or canceling the study. And as for ethics oversight, we provide some guidelines to facilitate deliberations by not only the ethics committee, but by the researchers themselves. regarding whether or not the study continues to have social and scientific value, and whether the participants have been treated fairly, and whether the benefits outweigh the risks, and appropriate informed consent, and respect for the participants throughout the entire study. On this occasion, our dialogue today is with members of research ethics committees from different parts of our region, and they are here speaking in their own personal capacity. Although they sit on ethics committees, they are not necessarily speaking on behalf of that committee. So we're trying to gain the different perspectives that are relevant to the ethics of COVID-19 research. And we want to thank the panelists for being so kind as to share their thoughts with us on this process. We know how busy you are in conducting ethics reviews of COVID-19 studies. We know you're very busy because all of us who are on ethics committees know that we have more work than ever before. And in addition, many of you are involved in the practice of this and may have greater responsibilities than you did before. So I now would like to give the floor to Sarah Caracedo, who's part of the PAHO's Bioethics program and also an affiliate of the National Health Institute of Peru, in which she works on research ethics issues. And I'm going to invite Sarah to present. I'd also like to present our panelists today. We have with us Martha González Bautista, who is a member of the Research Ethics Committee of the National Medical Specialties Hospital in Mexico. We also have Javier Lobato Polo with us, who is part of the Ethics Committee of the Valle de Lili Foundation in Colombia. We also have Mario Soriano with us, who is a member of the National Research Ethics Committee of El Salvador. And on this occasion, Ana Palmero, who is also affiliated with PAHO's Regional Bioethics Program, is going to play a different role today, both as a member of the Ramos Mejia Hospital Ethics Committee, but also as a member of the staff of the Ministry of Health of Argentina. And we were going to hear several sessions back, I think perhaps it was the first session, she talked about how she has come to play an advisory role for ethics committees to make sure that they can keep up with the pace of information production during the pandemic. Thank you very much, all of you, for being with us today, and I will now give the floor to Sarah to moderate.
Bien, ¿qué tal? Buenas tardes. Gracias por acompañarnos una vez más, esta vez en el quinto diálogo que se está organizando. Y para comenzar, vamos a hacer una pregunta en relación a la incertidumbre. Es decir, una pandemia se caracteriza por la incertidumbre, el grado de incertidumbre sobre la COVID y sus consecuencias ha ido cambiando conforme la pandemia ha ido desarrollándose en todo el mundo. Sin embargo, a la fecha aún no tenemos toda la información que quisiéramos sobre esta enfermedad y en particular aún existe incertidumbre sobre las intervenciones para su prevención y tratamiento. En ese contexto, quisiéramos comenzar preguntándoles cuáles han sido y son las mayores dificultades para evaluar el balance riesgo-beneficio en los estudios COVID, tal vez al evaluar los riesgos a grupos específicos o los riesgos de ciertas intervenciones, o tal vez ha sido difícil sopesar los riesgos con el beneficio del estudio. No sé, tal vez Marta, tú empezamos por ti, ¿nos quieres comentar cómo ha sido la experiencia?
Please tell us a little bit about your experience. Yes, I'd be glad to. And good morning to people in my time zone. Good afternoon to some of you. I'd like to talk about our hospitals in the 21st century, and this is part of the Mexican social security system in Mexico City. This is a hospital in which most of the researchers are on the front lines of battle against COVID-19. They're working overtime and they're conducting research and they're working on this. And we also have residents. So I want to tell you about this because a lot of the studies that have been conducted, which we have been reviewing, these are the ones in the past few months. Many of these studies are retrospective, and so that there isn't a, we don't have to do risk-benefit analysis there. So what we're doing is looking at an evaluation of risk-benefit. This is fundamental for an ethics committee in all studies, but some things must be subjective. They are not completely objective, as you might find in other kinds of situations. And this is why, for example, according to our law in Mexico, we divide protocols between no risk, minimal risk, or medium level risk.
So on the basis of this, we evaluate, assess each one of the protocols, and we always find that there is a benefit, an ideal benefit for the community. That is, the scientific or social value of the protocol has adapted to both the scientific and social value, and it changes, as you have said, and it has changed over the past months because information has changed. One of the situations we've encountered in assessing these protocols is that at times the group has chosen something that does not have an impact on social value. And when that happens, we try to insist that the benefit be a broader benefit, because sometimes when a resident is preparing a thesis, would like to find a benefit in a smaller group, say in ophthalmology or sociology, and that's when we try to point out to them that it's much more important for the benefit to be broader in the protocol. As to the more clinical and broader protocols, this risk has had to adapt to situations, because there have been some cases where a drug has already been determined to be useful, and so it's no longer useful to continue studying that drug. So we often insist that they try to do something that's more innovative, or a drug that's not been tested yet. Right now, for instance, where they had trials on medications that have already been approved and have been used, and we're beginning to see the usefulness of them in a retrospective manner. So that's how we assess a risk-benefit. During this period of the pandemic, and also given the type of research protocol. If not, we go back and get them to do it all over again to meet with our standards.
Ana, no
Thank
sé
you,
si
Marta.
tú tal vez nos quieres contar cómo se ha manejado el balance riesgo-beneficio frente a la incertidumbre de la pandemia.
In view of the pandemic's uncertainty. Well, in reference to the uncertainty, particularly what happened at the very beginning of the pandemic, we, as an ethics committee, we had to realize that given the lack of treatment, everything must be looked at. It looked at the very beginning that anything could be tested, and since we had nothing to compare with, let's go ahead with what we already had. And we found it was difficult to become more impartial and critical as an ethics committee, also as members of the committee, because we ourselves have been affected. There's also issues pertaining to the projects that have been presented. We've discussed study trials using placebo as a comparator, but the treatments that had not been approved for COVID antivirals, for instance, have been used as a standard for certain diseases, but we found that it didn't work in this case. So that has we included in the studies that have been presented, and the new trials using placebos, we realized was important because everything that was being used was experimental outside the clinical context, and we had to have solid results that would allow you to say whether, yes, we can test and use it now in the general population or not. That difference with a regular, normal situation where you don't have a solid justification for the study. Most of the justifications were based on studies that were being done in other countries as well because of time limits. So those justifications were given for performing a risk-benefit analysis. Now, as time went by and we started seeing the results of local trials, that we no longer were just studying what was being studied in other countries, we started seeing innovative local interventions being used. For instance, in our case, all the studies using plasma showed that new teams started organizing these kinds of larger trials with the participation of pretty much most of the country and most of the centers. In our case, we had the situation of a team that was a local initiative in Argentina using Swertikine, and we had to do a lot of risk-benefit analysis, meet with the researchers themselves, because we didn't even have experts to ask about the use of plasma. So there was a lot of need to work jointly with them and to follow up on these very innovative studies because there was no precedent for it. Particularly nothing in the use of COVID.
Gracias, Ana.
Thank you, Ana.
No sé si tal vez
I don't know if perhaps
Javier o Mario quisieran agregar
Javier
algo
or
como
Mario
desde
would
sus
like to add
comités han
something.
enfrentado el
How, from the
análisis
perspective of your
riesgo-beneficio
committees,
durante la
have
pandemia
you
y
had to
las
deal with the
investigaciones
risk-benefit
COVID?
balance during the pandemic? And specifically in terms of COVID.
Sí, Javier,
Good afternoon. Go ahead, Javier. Do you want
comentarnos algo?
to comment?
Sí, muchísimas gracias. La incertidumbre de esta situación totalmente nueva para las generaciones que están vivas actualmente.
Uncertainty for current generations led to an initial wave of fear. And as you know, fear very often tends to make human beings act in a precipitous manner. So the ethics committee, and in our experience, we're in Cali, but in all of Colombia, we met with the ethics committees, and we analyzed the situation because we found that there were all sorts of management protocols without any kind of scientific evidence, for instance, using viral medication as a prophylactic means, for instance. And what was hard at the beginning was dealing with the fear and that wave of questions and clinical protocols without having any research protocol supporting it. Then we started seeing some controlled research protocols. And the idea was to have a basis, a platform to begin treatments within the community. And I think this is important for the future, for lesson learned for the future when you have looking at things in a more objective manner, when you're dealing with situations that you have to deal with fear. I'm a neurosurgeon, for instance, and there's a lot of situations where you just need a cool head. And what's important, therefore, is to figure out how to channel that fear and be as objective as possible in assessment and in the orientation that has to be given to the researchers. And neither they nor we were prepared for this, but you have to orient them during the research, as we have always done. I think in the future, or rather, excuse me, as the situation evolved, situations arose that opened up channels for the research that we are now doing and creating medications for more vulnerable populations, children, pregnant women. That's going to have to be the first step of this whole process. Thank you.
Mario, tal vez nos quieres comentar cómo han enfrentado esto en El Salvador, cómo ha sido este análisis riesgo-beneficio de las investigaciones frente a tanta incertidumbre que caracteriza esta pandemia.
Research in view of the uncertainties typical of this pandemic. With pleasure. Good morning to everyone. First of all, I'd like to begin by saying I have no conflict of interest in terms of the information I will be sharing, because I'm part of the National Research Ethics Committee. Now, in terms of difficulties encountered, well, when we found out about the emergence of the pandemic, we as a country had to develop a new agenda for research and innovation. What did that mean? All the ethical issues we had created 3 months before, the national research agenda for all areas, meant that we were now facing the first uncertainty. What were we going to do with this new challenge? For us, the greatest difficulty has been that the research is taking place in different social contexts, different economic contexts, even political contexts, because in the different municipalities in the country, we also have to deal with the local governments, and to a certain extent that has either restricted or facilitated these studies, the trials. So I agree with others who have said that one of the difficulties has been that we have to have studies with an adaptive design, because this was something completely new for our committee, because we had to review and revise methodological designs that were different from what we had been doing before. And of course, in evaluating or assessing ethical aspects, we've had to consider how you do that when you don't have the full certainty of the adaptive model that's now being used as a methodology. And also those all the things that have to do with the collecting information and analysis. Those are the problems we faced in this country, from the more general area to the more specific, in looking at the methodology, the trials, and of course, revising and changing our ethical
Mario,
protocols.
por la respuesta.
Thank you,
Justo,
Mario, for that answer.
Me sirve algo que has mencionado para pasar a la siguiente,
¿no?
Durante la pandemia debemos garantizar que aprendamos tanto y tan rápido como sea posible. Entonces, esta necesidad de generar evidencia rápidamente para dar respuestas de salud y por consiguiente reducir esta incertidumbre de la que previamente conversamos es más que evidente. Esto ha llevado a muchos investigadores a que muchos investigadores planteen diseños científicos novedosos como los estudios con diseños adaptativos que hace un segundo Mario nos mencionaba. Quería saber si es que sus comités han recibido protocolos de este tipo de diseños u otros, y cómo es que han manejado estas propuestas de investigación. ¿Cómo han hecho para revisarlas? ¿Han utilizado alguna estrategia para facilitar la evaluación? No sé, a ver si nos cuentan un poco sobre eso. Tal vez Mario, tú quieres iniciar.
Mario, maybe you might want to start. With pleasure. Well, as you said, the challenge of reacting quickly, not just to understand the situation, but to address the emerging problem caused by the pandemic meant that we had to undertake an exercise within our own committee. For instance, in the case of El Salvador, we had been meeting every 15 days to be able to report on what we had thought in the various studies that or trials that had been reviewed, and they were distributed in order to be more effective. And only those that required analysis of the full group meant that during that 15-day period, we'd have time to analyze it and come up with a conclusion. But what do we have to do now? Whether it was an adaptive study, which we haven't in fact had any in El Salvador, most of them have used the regular methodological method, but whatever it was, we had to respond quickly, which meant that we had to set up a virtual communication mechanism sustained over time. And what do I mean by that? Instead of meeting every 15 days, we started meeting twice a week. And in those twice a week meetings, the full committee had the opportunity to review the documents pertaining to the pandemic. Why? What was the purpose? One, to be able to respond quickly to the researchers. Two, to include in the model the good clinical practices audit and include that. How are you going to do that? Usually you do it in person. You go to the research center, you look at the installed capacity they have, and but now we had to establish virtual contact with those people who were going to be leading the research. So in addition to the other challenges, we had to change completely the agenda of our meetings, the dynamics of how we review and revise the studies, and of course, also the communication we now had with the research leaders.
Marta, tal vez tú nos quieras contar si es que han recibido alguna propuesta de investigación con un diseño novedoso y cómo es que han manejado esta situación
and how
en el
have
comité.
you handled that situation in your committee? No, we haven't had any of these protocols reach us. In fact, I was looking at all of our protocols that have been presented to the committee before the meeting, and we haven't had any. And as a result of that, we met with the researchers at the hospital and expressed to us our concerns, to tell them that there were many other options of protocols in addition to what they were using. We haven't yet had a request, but our concern is that they should be familiar with these other protocols so that they take them into account working with their students. So we are contacting them so that all of us can be educated about these new and innovative options that exist. Let me make an additional comment to the previous question you asked about the cost-benefit assessment. And that's got to do with the importance of informed consent with patients at this time. It is crucial in order to protect the human rights of the patient. That's all I wanted to say. We shouldn't forget to have a good review of the informed consent form when we look at the risk assessment of this protocol. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you. Thank you, Marta.
Javier, tal vez tú quieras agregar algo, si es que han revisado o han recibido algún protocolo de diseño, digamos, novedoso, qué estrategias han hecho para su revisión.
And what strategies have you used to look at these? Well, in our committee, let me just describe how we work in about 20 seconds. In our ethics committee at our institute, we evaluate studies contracted out by industry, pharmaceutical companies, and collaborative studies with universities. Those are academic studies. So as a result of the pandemic, we had to make a full change in our structure and move 100% to virtual meetings. All our meetings are virtual, and the flow of documents takes place electronically. So we have a industrial study that is an adaptive study for therapeutic drugs, and we have for therapeutic modalities, and we have other study on clinical trials. The COVID studies, as a directive from the regulatory body in Colombia, they provide us the guidance and we must follow them, means that the ethics studies on COVID have to be given priority. So locally, our academic and industrial studies have been divided into different groups, and we have decided that the plenary of the committee should assess the COVID studies because of the complexity of those studies. Now, in terms of adaptive studies, we think they're quite relevant in the situation where we have an unknown germ, too quick dissemination of the disease, a large number of sick people, which provide data fairly quickly to the scientific community. So we are constantly receiving reports, everyone's receiving reports on the effectiveness of drugs, and some are discarded because of the adaptive studies. We've also received security reports, which can change the protocol of trial. In these studies, almost all studies, we have a follow-up and supervision plan. For the COVID trials, we have a weekly meeting to develop 3-month follow-up plans, and annually, depending on the complexity of the study. But in the case of coronavirus trials, we follow up on a weekly basis because these are adaptive studies that have a much higher level of complexity.
Javier. Ana, tal vez nos quieras contar la situación de Argentina, bueno, de tu comité, cómo han manejado estas propuestas de investigación novedosas, qué estrategias han recurrido para facilitar su revisión.
We have received adaptive studies, and I agree with Javier that the important thing is to be in continuous contact with all information and the participants. So any change with regard to the branches and everything, and this should be done clearly and shouldn't compromise the confidence in the study. So this is innovative. We're going to stop giving one drug and begin giving another one. It's important to inform people to avoid any misunderstandings among the participants and also amongst the ethics committees. Another issue that we found novel was that during the stages weren't the same because of this need to have evidence much more quickly. And so we've bunched together different stages. So sometimes it was stage 2 or stage 2C, and this is also true with the vaccine studies. And we've also seen this in the ministry, where the large vaccine studies conducted throughout the region have been presented to the ministries before they come before the ethics committee. And I think this is important with all the new studies, in which obviously it's impossible for each committee to have specialists on each of the topics. It's been very important to have collaboration amongst the various committees to share concerns and to jointly analyze what's happening with those studies in particular. And what I've also seen from the researchers, and perhaps this has helped us because we're using new technology, webinars, YouTube, a lot of people have presented their studies this way. It's a very defined audience, a scientific audience, but it might be done more openly, like over YouTube, and this allows the members of the committee to have access to that information, where at another time it might have been more restricted. That may have been just limited to academia and to scientists. So I think that communications between members of the committees and the investigators has been important, not only at the time of conducting the evaluation, but also for monitoring them. And so, as I say, communication has also been important in terms of when adverse effects, adverse events occur, you can react quickly, you can have these reports.
Gracias por las respuestas.
Thank you
Ahora,
for your
para seguir conversando sobre esta necesidad de desarrollar evidencia rápidamente y cómo ustedes, sus comités de ética en investigación han enfrentado esto, tal vez quiero recordar algo que mencionó Carla al inicio de este diálogo, ¿no? Mucha de la evidencia que se ha producido muy rápidamente en todas partes del mundo puede impactar en los balances riesgo-beneficio de las investigaciones aprobadas por los comités que ya están en marcha. Por ejemplo, un estudio que fue revisado por el comité tenía un balance favorable de riesgo-beneficio, puede dejar de tenerlo cuando se está realizando ya el estudio. Y tal vez para poner un ejemplo de lo que me refiero, está el caso de la hidroxicloroquina, ¿no? Al inicio de la pandemia, muchos estudios probaban la hidroxicloroquina como tratamiento para COVID, sin embargo, aparecen los resultados del ensayo clínico de Recovery que mostraron futilidad de este fármaco. Y entonces todos estos estudios en marcha tuvieron que ser revisados, tuvieron que repensarse, que cambiarse, y por ejemplo el Solidarity terminó cerrando la rama de hidroxicloroquina, para poner un ejemplo. Entonces, ante esta posibilidad de que la nueva evidencia genere un impacto o afecte los balances riesgo-beneficio de las investigaciones que ya están en plena ejecución y que ya han sido aprobadas por los comités de ustedes, tal vez preguntarles qué medidas han tomado o creen en todo caso que deberían tomarse para resguardar ese balance de riesgo-beneficio durante la realización de investigación. Y en general, tal vez quisiéramos que nos cuenten un poco cómo supervisan los estudios en curso, teniendo en cuenta el panorama tan cambiante de la evidencia en plena pandemia. No sé si, Ana, comenzamos por ti.
Amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. Anna, we'll start with you. Yes, hydroxychloroquine is a good case because it was a matter of scientific information and also media-produced information. And all of this means that we have had to see about the studies that have been approved, particularly new studies that were being proposed. I'm going to repeat what I said before. The most important thing is to have communication. It has to be much more fluid. There has to be fluid communication between the committees and the researchers, and through reports or a note within a certain period of time. Before that, all seemed just very bureaucratic, but now this has become, well, send me an email or call me on the phone or whatever. And I also think that there's been some back and forth with the committees. For example, in Argentina, we've established accelerated procedures, and this means that the researchers also have to do everything much more quickly. In many cases, it has not been necessary for the researcher to provide additional information, but rather for the information to come in. So there is a challenge here in terms of the need to have follow-up with these studies, generally because these are short studies. They may be done over the course of 24 days or a month at the most. So we have a mechanism for continuous oversight of each of the studies is a major challenge. But perhaps we if we learn about any adverse reactions, we need to have that information and get this report as soon as it comes out. That has really helped us have more
Gracias,
close
Ana.
oversight of the
Javier, tal
study.
vez
Thank you,
nos quieras
Ana.
contar
Javier, would you
cómo
like to tell us
desde
a
tu
little bit
comité
about
han
how
evaluado
in
este
your
balance
committee
riesgo-beneficio a
you
lo
have
largo
looked
de la
at
investigación
the
y si es que hubo evidencia que pudo impactar
benefits
en esta
outweighing the
evaluación, qué
risks,
medidas adoptaron o en
and
todo
if this
caso,
has
qué crees
changed,
que se debería
what
hacer
measures
ante
have
esos
you taken, or
escenarios?
what do you think should be done in such a situation?
Javier.
Javier, you have the floor. I'm sorry, the sound cut out for me and I thought you were asking someone else. So the idea, when you do a cost-benefit analysis in such a novel situation, it is very important to not only look at this under a microscope, but perhaps under several microscopes. You need to have people in charge of the study and have to keep the lines of communication open 24/7. Previously, as was mentioned by the doctor, this was very formal, and it continues to be very formal in terms of the letters, but we found that decisions also have to be made based on events as they're happening. Sometimes you have to do it communicate through a video call or whatever. So this type of oversight, as I said before, we're looking at this, we're looking at the publicity, and for COVID, we have weekly follow-up sessions. We're trying to learn firsthand about all of these situations that occur, any adverse events, any lack of effectiveness, the suspension of a significant part of a study. Another thing is with regard to the patients involved in a clinical trial or something, we continue to monitor them after the study. When we issue the letter of approval, since the pandemic started, we begin to establish some parameters for the researchers, as I said before, and there's a consensus on this within the Research Ethics Committee of Colombia for them to follow these guidelines to ensure the safety of the participants in the study. We need to maximize the benefits and maximize the benefits and minimize the risks. So it's not just a matter of drugs, but also once the clinical trial is over, we have to follow up with them, and we make a commitment to monitor them after the trial ends.
Gracias, Javier.
Thank
No sé
you,
si Mario,
Javier.
Marta
Mario
quieren
Marta,
agregar algo
would
sobre
you
este
like
punto.
to add anything
¿Cómo
on this
hacemos con el
point?
seguimiento
What
de
do
las
we do
investigaciones y en
to
marcha?
monitor research studies that are while they're underway? Yes, I'd like to share a comment on this. I confirm that communication is, and we have to have new means of communicating with researchers. This has played a very important role. However, I must tell you that one practice that we have had is to develop local capacity, and communication in our case is important with local ethics committees that are distributed throughout the departments of our country. And this has allowed us to establish constant communication over time, but to also train them in the new tools that we're often obtaining. This means that when all of the models are shared through international communication pages, then our committee, national committee, communicates this to the local committees, and we immediately tell them about the studies that are underway in order to help them monitor what is happening in their hospitals. Second, it is also important in our case, our committee has established direct lines of communications with the health system. And I'm talking specifically about the Ministry of Health for El Salvador is the entity that governs the health system. Why is this? Because they not only look at aspects related to knowledge of the virus and its impact and virulence, viral load, but also we need to know about the impact it has had on other programs, such as antenatal checkups and other monitoring of NCDs. So all of this is very important to look at the risk-benefit analysis when there are rapid changes, either in the methodology or results that may come out.
Marta, ¿quieres
Marta, do you have anything to add? Yes. In our committee, what we do is monitor this. Most of the members of the committee work in the hospital and are in touch with both the researchers and the patients. So our monitoring is done in person. The important thing is to have continuous follow-up, and there are other situations that we've supported. We have experts from outside the committee that help us do our evaluations and monitoring. So this also distributes the work of the committee to make sure that we have the support of external researchers, people who are experts on the topic that we're evaluating. So that's what I have to say. You have to have monitoring and support of experts in order to minimize risk.
Gracias, Marta,
Thank
por
you,
la respuesta.
Marta, for that answer.
Y tal vez ahora podamos hablar de algo que tú mencionaste muy rápidamente hace un rato sobre el consentimiento informado y las personas que participan en investigaciones en general. La pandemia nos enfrenta con esta necesidad de realizar investigaciones en situaciones de urgencia, ¿no? Personas que padecen de una condición aguda, que requieren intervenciones en un periodo de tiempo, digamos, limitado y que sufrirán consecuencias serias si es que no reciben ninguna intervención eficaz a la larga, ¿no? Entonces, este estado de vulnerabilidad de los pacientes con COVID responden entonces a la enfermedad misma, o sea, al COVID, pero también a las condiciones de hospitalización, de aislamiento, etc. ¿Cómo influye esta situación particular de los pacientes COVID en el análisis riesgo-beneficio de las investigaciones? Tal vez empezamos por ti, Marta.
Risk-benefit analysis of proposed research. Marta, yes, as I'm sure has happened to many of you, I have had to be involved in direct COVID-19 patient care. These are very stressful situations for both the patient and the physician. Isolation is the rule. Family members may not visit them. The patients are experiencing tremendous anxiety, and so are the physicians, at least at the beginning, but we have a little bit more confidence now. But as I said, this is a very vulnerable group of people. And so conducting a risk-benefit analysis for this type of population, well, we consider this based on our risk-benefit evaluation protocol. We want protocols to point out new things that have not been previously proven, and ideally, they, insofar as possible, they should include potential for being compared to other treatments of shown utilities, such as dexamethasone. But in a not so much risk-benefit analysis in the situation of vulnerability is how you obtain informed consent in these very vulnerable people, because the patient is here and their family members are over there. So sometimes the protocol is only through the patient. Sometimes we only have patients who are of legal age, and they're the ones who sign the consent form after an explanation. But most of the patients accept it. They agree to be part of these protocols. So the issue is, as is stated in the risk evaluation, It is not the same to offer a drug to a patient who is not sick as it is to offer a drug to a patient who is gravely ill. So part of the informed consent is that it has to be true. We have to be truthful. We have to say it is not proven. And it may have been done on animals or in a different country, but these are the risks, these are the benefits, and explain this. And the patients are the ones who autonomously have the right to say yes or no. Then subsequently might be sent on to their relative person. You have to disinfect the documents, but we pass it on to their relatives to sign the consent form. But this is part of the protocol itself. And on this question, I would say that the most difficult situation has been that of informed consent that needs to be truthful and very easy to understand. Explain this in plain language understood by the patient.
Gracias, Marta, por la intervención. Ana, tal vez tú nos quieras comentar cómo es que ha influenciado en el análisis riesgo-beneficio de las investigaciones el especial estado de vulnerabilidad en pacientes con COVID.
Research has been affected by the particular COVID situation. Well, I'd like to refer to what Marta was talking about, the studies. I think at the very beginning of the pandemic, we found we had a huge number of options for the same disease. So the evaluation was not just of one single protocol, but a whole series of protocols. Sometimes it was a protocol targeting the same population with the same institution. Let me give you an example. For the same population, acute patients with pneumonia, one study using plasma and the other one using monoclonal antibodies. We know that the risks are different, but the things were very similar. The expectations were very similar. So the risk-benefit balance was not just for one study, but one trial, but two trials. And that's what led us to think about overall assessment, because we didn't know how many trials were going to present it, how many kinds of interventions would appear, and yet it would all be done on the same population. So that's presented a challenge. Not just how do you do a risk-benefit assessment, but how do you take into account the large number of studies targeting the same population. So I agree with Marta also on the informed consent form, that it must be consistent with the situation in which those situations are found in the hospital. It should be easily understood, short, and somebody be able to explain it to them so that they could have some sort of support, even though they may not have the physical presence of a family member, and because they're in isolation. But also the risks, not just for the patient, but for the entire team. What would happen with the resources of that institution during a pandemic? The most important thing is to be able to provide the care. So how do you weigh the medical role, and which is also now a researcher, two different roles. So that has to be taken into account in the risk-benefit assessment, because of course most of the participants were in a very vulnerable position.
Mario, tal vez
Thank you,
de
Javier Mario. Maybe one of you would like to comment on what you've done with the risk-benefit assessment in a unit with COVID patients. Well, the original premise in our committee is that any patient affected by COVID is vulnerable. And therefore, the analysis of our research has to further acknowledge those questions have to do with gender, because it has affected more men than women. Also, the questions of mental health. You must keep in mind that all of these people have not just been affected biologically by COVID, but they've also had an impact on them. The fact that they've been physically distant. Remember that physical proximity is part of our anthropology. So one of our premises in the analysis was to identify how COVID is affecting patients from the perspective of gender, the life course, because boys, girls, adolescents are more affected, not so much physically, but by the other aspects of the disease, the social distancing, mental health. Thank you.
Javier, no sé si tú quieres agregar algo sobre este punto de la vulnerabilidad de los pacientes y cómo esto puede impactar en el análisis riesgo-beneficio.
Have an impact on the risk-benefit analysis. Well, most of my panelists have mentioned the very important points. We also feel that patients with coronavirus, particularly those in intensive care and isolation, are highly vulnerable, particularly during the initial phase of the pandemic, where there was total confinement and complete restriction of individuals. Family members could not even come to the hospital. So in the clinical as well as research perspective, we had to make certain adjustments, particularly in the informed consent form, to allow for communication with the family and family representatives, so that they could have some easy access to information and easy access to a document that they could sign and provide consent, or at least verify the informed consent took place. The other thing is that in assessing the research protocols to minimize risks and maximize benefit for vulnerable patients, we were particularly strict with the inclusion and exclusion criteria so as not to leave out risks or ignore the possibility of having complications in patients that were being studied by researchers. And it was important to talk to the researchers and make sure that this inclusivity was addressed.
Javier.
Thank you, Javier.
Finalmente, ya para cerrar el diálogo entre ustedes, entre nosotros por el día de hoy, y antes de pasar a las preguntas de los asistentes, quería hacer una pregunta sobre la exclusión de los participantes en las investigaciones COVID, ¿no? Y tal como ocurre usualmente en situaciones ordinarias, es decir, en situaciones de no pandemia, muchos estudios tienden a excluir sistemáticamente a niños, adolescentes, a mujeres embarazadas, lactantes, incluso cuando, por ejemplo, estamos hablando de investigaciones, de intervenciones que ya han sido probadas, digamos, en mujeres embarazadas, ¿no?
Interventions that have already been tested in pregnant women. For instance, remdesivir was tested in pregnant women during Ebola. So my question is, what thoughts do you have about excluding minors or pregnant women from the COVID studies?
En particular tal vez ensayos de vacunas u otros ensayos preventivos, y cuál creen que debería ser el rol de un comité de ética ante estas situaciones. No sé, tal vez, Marta, ¿quieres empezar?
Do you want to start? Well, we know what the definition is of a vulnerable person, which is somebody who cannot make a decision for his own self-care. And pregnant women and underage children are a part of this group, although they would not be doubly vulnerable because if they had COVID. But in our hospital, we don't see children. And as to pregnant women, I did have to treat a few women, but most of them go. But I do have about these vulnerable groups. The vulnerable groups, as we know, require special care. In Mexico, there is a program that specifically targets reducing maternal fetal mortality. So pregnant women, from the moment they are pregnant, and once the baby is a year old, they are given special treatment. All the specialists that need to treat them. It's called the maternal code. From ethics, it's clear to us is that pregnant women should not be excluded from the research. However, we need to take two things into account: decrease the risk to the fetus or decrease it as much as possible, and two, that there be informed consent, and the informed consent should clearly explain to the mother and the father of the risks this trial has for the mother and the fetus. And ideally, there should be research protocols that are exclusively for these vulnerable groups, either pregnant women or underage children. Because of the more common occurrences of COVID, this does not happen as often, but there are cases of
Gracias. Ana, tal vez tú quieres agregar algo
Ana,
sobre la
would
exclusión
you like to
sistemática
add
de
something on
niños,
the
mujeres
systematic
embarazadas
exclusion
de
of
las investigaciones
children
COVID
or pregnant
sin
women
justificación
from
muchas veces?
COVID trials without any justification often? Well, yes, I think that in our country, there's sort of the general rule that you protect people by excluding them, when we realize that should not be the case, and that these groups should be included in research, but often there are reasons why we have to exclude them. Most of the studies that I looked at established as a criteria for exclusion the pregnant women, even in the use of interventions that have already been proved and tested for pregnant women, when we know that there are pregnant women sick with COVID and continue to get COVID. So we don't have any specific treatment for that group in particular. As to children, it's true that it's a disease that hasn't affected them specifically. It does affect more the elderly, but I have seen some sort of preventive studies, and we know that both children and adolescents usually are asymptomatic. They have or very minor symptoms, and yet they do transmit the disease. And I haven't seen that they've included children nor adolescents in most of the studies. Now, as to the vaccine trials, there are several trials underway here for vaccines. There's one in particular that is including pregnant women, but we haven't received the amendment to it yet. So we don't know if they're going to present it. And I see this not just as a general rule in most committees, but even with the regulatory agencies, it's sort of seen as a rule that you need to exclude pregnant women as a protection. Personally, I think it's something we have to address in my country and in the region in changing that very narrow view. It's not that we're not going to protect them, but I don't think that pregnant women are a particularly vulnerable group. I don't consider myself a vulnerable group as a woman in general, even when I'm not pregnant. And in terms of children, it's often very easy to include them because they have a representative and a father or mother and some family member that's responsible for them. So I think it is something we need to address in the region to change this mentality, this focus, because we we should, as a committee, ask the researchers to justify why they don't include it. Maybe they'll have a reason, justification, but I do think we should try to get that general rule to be changed, or at least get them to justify why they feel it should be excluded.
Javier Mario, ¿ustedes tienen alguna reflexión sobre esta exclusión sistemática a ciertas poblaciones, a ciertos grupos de las investigaciones COVID y que al final terminan pues desprotegiéndolos y privándolos de la investigación?
Ends up not protecting it and depriving them of the research results. I would like to say something very important that happened here. And I'll say it happened here because it started with the pandemic. Exclusion comes from the perspective of the researcher, his views and what he is researching, because the person that would take the leadership for the research were usually the doctors who treat adult patients. So they automatically excluded children or pregnant women because most of these people were internists that dealt with adults. But afterward, we realized that we should not deny attention to children, pregnant, elderly, and even less so to these. And that's when we started doing studies with girls and boys, making sure that we met with all the protocols and also included pregnant women. So my thoughts are that that exclusion occurred because of the need of information the specialist who is leading the research project has, and the
Gracias, Mario. Javier, tú tal vez quieres añadir alguna reflexión final antes de culminar esta parte.
Before we conclude this section? Yes. It's very difficult, and when the pandemic started, we didn't know what to do exactly. But as the evidence came out on the medications that worked and those that didn't, that supports a bit more in terms of safety for the fetus and for children, or what they're referred to as vulnerable populations. And I would say that pregnant women may have other things that make them vulnerable, and usually because of teratogenicity of drugs, most drug trials exclude pregnant women. But there are some that have come out where we do know their efficiency, such as corticosteroids, that have no problem with children or pregnant women. So even though there is sufficient evidence to show that corticosteroids are okay, and those people should participate. But with new molecules, because of prudence and to avoid risk, they should not include these vulnerable people when studying new molecules, or if they haven't been shown proven safety for those two vulnerable populations.
Gracias, Javier, gracias a todos. Gracias por sus intervenciones. Creo que esta última reflexión sobre esta exclusión generalizada de ciertos grupos, como bien lo han sugerido ustedes, debe tener pues en cuenta que si no tenemos una justificación científica sólida que sustente esta exclusión, estamos pues protegiendo a estas personas y privándolos de los potenciales beneficios de la investigación, ¿no? Situación que además se va a agravar porque, como sabemos, la enfermedad del COVID no discrimina y nos puede afectar a todos, incluyendo niños, mujeres embarazadas y demás. Solamente antes de pasar a las preguntas de los asistentes, tal vez mencionar que existe la orientación de Prevent para la inclusión de embarazadas en los estudios de vacunas contra patógenos emergentes. Carla ha puesto el link en el chat, la tenemos en español, entonces creo que es un documento de mucha ayuda para miembros de comités de ética como ustedes, ¿no? Y como muchos de los que estamos acá. Bien, ahora vamos a pasar a las preguntas que tienen los asistentes. Y la primera es sobre la evaluación de riesgos de los ensayos clínicos en vacunas para COVID, ¿no? ¿Están los integrantes de sus comités capacitados para realizar estas evaluaciones de riesgos en los ensayos de vacunas para COVID? ¿Hay como integrante o es que tal vez tienen algún asesor inmunólogo? ¿Cómo han abordado este desafío? Y si es que hay alguna estrategia en particular que ustedes quisieran compartir con todos nosotros para la evaluación de estudios de vacunas COVID. Ana, no sé si tal vez empezamos por ti.
Ana, could we start with you? Yes, in our case, as I said, we didn't have much experience.
With some, we have been asked to evaluate a vaccine. We've needed expert advice, and the Ministry of Health of the city of Buenos Aires, which is where the hospital or committee works in, is housed. There's been a whole set of interaction amongst the various committees that have been in charge of studies that could have generated this type of problem. Who do we ask? What do you do with this situation? So there is a consultation strategy amongst committees looking at the same study. And in addition, particularly when there are multi-center studies, there is an over-evaluation of the studies. And there are some things that could be requested or comments. This has been very helpful, and I repeat that the researchers have been very responsive when we've requested additional information. And I think there's also been a lot of extra information beyond the protocol itself in terms of information and material that has also served as support documentation for assessing.
Gracias, Ana. No sé si alguno más ha tenido oportunidad de revisar proyectos clínicos, ensayos clínicos de candidatos a vacunas y cómo han hecho esta evaluación. No sé si alguien más quisiera agregar algo.
This kind of evaluation. Would anyone like to add something? Yes, I'd like to comment on this. In the case of El Salvador, one of the first steps that we took was to establish contact with the team, the PAHO, the Expanded Immunization Program. So not just the Ministry of Health, but the entire health sector. This allowed us to make it evident that while we need a vaccine, which of course we do, but in order to be a candidate for the study, we need to comply with these requirements. We needed to look at the scientific need to measure the impact, but also the ethical requirement to protect the participants who may be involved in the study. We have completely based this on a reading of shared evidence from PAHO, WHO in Latin America. This has thus allowed us to reach that meeting point between the needs of the public health system and, of course, our need to defend the rights of potential participants. That's what I wanted to share with you.
Gracias, Mario.
Thank
Marta,
you,
Javier,
Mario.
tal vez quieren compartir alguna experiencia en esta evaluación de los riesgos de los ensayos clínicos de candidatos a vacunas, ¿cómo han hecho para poder enfrentar esta situación? ¿Tenían algún consultor, especialistas en vacunas dentro del comité tal vez?
Or vaccine specialists within your ethics committees? We have not done vaccine trial evaluations. The National Ethics Committee does this, but without a doubt, I would always request the support of vaccine experts if that type of situation arose.
Javier,
yes, of course. Thank you, Marta.
Me parece que ustedes sí han revisado ensayos clínicos de vacunas.
Have reviewed vaccine clinical trials. Yes, we currently have 2 vaccine clinical trials underway. One is just about to start. after a long review period, and another one which was just evaluated. First, we make sure that we look at the scientific basis and justification of the study. We make sure that it's very detailed and well documented. And then we have the researchers at our clinical center, and these are virologists who are very well acquainted with immunizations, and we exchange information to expand it so that the members of the committee can be clear, particularly on the entire vaccine process. These vaccines, well, a brief aside, something new, these are not the usual types of vaccines in which they kill the virus. They change it. This has led to some changes to biomolecular technology and biogenetics in terms of manipulation of viruses and other vaccines. So all of this has helped us understand this through a direct dialogue with this, and also in a study that's in studies that are in the hands of the researchers and all the evidence that is available.
Javier.
Thank you.
Otra pregunta que tengo aquí es, ¿cuáles son los riesgos que han identificado que afectan a los sujetos de investigación y cómo los han abordado, ¿no? Tal vez podrían compartirnos alguna estrategia que han utilizado para minimizar los riesgos a los participantes. No sé quién se anima a contestar.
Who would like to start? I would like to share with you what we have done in El Salvador. When a study comes in with these characteristics or on this subject matter, we immediately call in the researcher to meet with the team to give us more context. Throughout the research project, they sometimes don't really tell us what they expect to prove with this. So we want to clarify that and also clarify things having to do with the bibliography, what they're trying to answer. So we want to share that with you. You have to meet with the researcher. That plays a very important role in terms of elucidating the risk that may be involved in the study.
Gracias, Mario. No sé si,
Thank you, Mario.
Alguno otro de nuestros panelistas quiere contarnos las estrategias que han utilizado para minimizar los riesgos, cuáles han sido los riesgos identificados más comunes tal vez en las investigaciones que han realizado.
I'd like to speak. There are two major groups of risk, as I mentioned, in terms of people not being able to move around, as the research studies, as a country like others, we have a mandatory quarantine. No one can leave their houses. And even a lot of transportation modes have been shut down. So that increases risk, and it's not only for COVID studies, but I think it's also important to mention the other studies underway. This is something that really hit us throughout Colombia, and I imagine it affected you too. So we have the participants in studies that are already underway. There are immunosuppressed patients that need to be under strict observation. So the first threat that we faced was that we had to remove some of those studies that were underway. We had to not neglect them. We needed to have communication and transportation for them. We needed to even to go to their houses for biosafety reasons. And then we had the COVID studies. And so, as the other doctor said, it's very important to have communication with the researcher continuously, and the work team needs to be in touch with us, and the other way as well. Everyone should be very clear on the channels of communication. A lot of the risks have already been established in the protocol or prior studies, and to a certain degree we're familiar with them, but the important thing is to identify them in order to respond rapidly. And there are also other logistical challenges. You don't want to lose the patient during follow-up, so that's a matter of the protocol, but it is very important to have communication between the patient and the research team and us. Thank you.
Gracias, Javier. Marta, sí.
Yes, Marta. I think that it should be like I don't know if we want to have vertical or horizontal communication, but it should be a communication system that goes from the ethics committee to the researcher, experts, and the patients. Excuse me for insisting on this, but ultimately the one taking on the risk is the patient. So, because no one really knows whether new things might come about aside from all the research underway. So we need to bring in all of the various stakeholders, the ethics committee, the researchers, advisors, and don't forget that the patient is the one that we're all there for, and that is the individual who will decide whether or not they will participate. And we need to be able to tell them whether or not we do not know whether this will work. So I just wanted to add that to the previous response. I'd like to add something, Sarah. Unlike routine situations in which everyone has been asked to conduct a clinical trial, you have to have plans and lay out the risks, and not only related to the participants in the study, but also to avoid spreading the disease and protect the team itself and the entire health team at the institution. And this has been evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Also, in light of the considerations that Javier mentioned, informed consent, and what we're going to do if a patient has been discharged from the hospital. So these logistical issues, all of these new situations also need to be considered, in which there is a prolonged quarantine and isolation. That needs to be looked at ahead of time, and there needs to be a budget to look at this because it may entail increased expenditures that you don't expect in a usual clinical trial.
Esta pregunta también está dirigida para las personas, nuestros panelistas que han evaluado ensayos clínicos de vacunas, y en específico de fase 2. Y lo que nos dicen es de que cómo han abordado la evaluación de los ensayos clínicos de vacuna de fase 2, en la que no hay suficiente información de seguridad del candidato de vacuna porque es nuevo, y de modo que no tenemos información previa sobre los eventos adversos. ¿Cómo han hecho para evaluar el análisis riesgo-beneficio de este tipo de ensayos en particular?
Anna says that for me, we have reviews 2 stage 3 trials, but all the studies on vaccines that are coming up are really based on previous vaccines. So it's not that it's something completely new that you need to look at from scratch. We've also seen that in stage 2, this is the information you have from stage 3. Stage 2 has been very short, but also for that same reason. There is a set of prior knowledge of the technology that they want to apply. It's not that we're really starting from zero. So I don't know if others may have more experience with stage 2. What we've assessed has been stage 3. And I agree with what Anna says in terms of the stage 2 studies, but what we've had has been stage 3. Thank you.
Bueno, aquí tenemos otra pregunta sobre la inclusión de mujeres embarazadas en específico. Si bien la región ha progresado mucho en la inclusión responsable de mujeres embarazadas en investigaciones, que además es algo fundamental para asegurarnos que las mujeres embarazadas no sean injustamente excluidas de la producción de evidencia, Sin embargo, en situaciones de emergencia las cosas son más difíciles que en situaciones ordinarias, ¿no? Entonces, ¿alguno de ustedes ha evaluado en específico algún estudio en donde se hayan enrolado mujeres embarazadas o en donde estén las mujeres embarazadas como potenciales participantes? Y si es así, ¿cómo en estos casos han evaluado el análisis riesgo-beneficio? ¿Han hecho alguna tal vez distinción especial? ¿Han implementado alguna protección adicional? No sé, les doy la palabra. ¿Quién se anima a responder?
I offer the floor to whoever would like to answer that. We had a study at the beginning of the pandemic during the first prophylactic stage with chloroquine. And in this study, as a country endemic for malaria, we have been able to prove the effectiveness of chloroquine on several occasions for malaria. So we're applying to this our situation as the Ethics Committee for high risk obstetric patients. So we incorporated pregnant women, as what you say. We felt that first there was some uncertainty during the first 3 months of the pandemic and the absence of effective treatment and of a vaccine. And there was a drug out there that there wasn't any evidence about, but there was some biographical literature. And so we were considering whether or not pregnant women could participate because the dosages applied are 10 times smaller than what's applied for malaria. So we did include high-risk obstetric payments who need to have very close monitoring. And they did this during the 4 prophylactic dosages, but we have not done
Gracias,
this on
Javier. No
other
sé si
pregnant women.
algún otro panelista quisiera
Thank you,
compartir
Javier.
sus
Would any other
experiencias.
panelists like
¿Han
to
tenido la
share
oportunidad de
their
revisar
experience?
algún
Have you had
estudio en
the
donde se
opportunity to
incluya
review
mujeres
any
embarazadas
study
y
that
cómo ha sido
included
este
pregnant
análisis
women?
riesgo-beneficio?
And how did you
at 12.
conduct your risk-benefit analysis?
No.
One of the
Just listen to the
advantages,
message.
says
He said
Mauricio,
he's gonna be
one
here
of the
at 12. His
advantages we
number
have
is
had in
20.
El
Write
Salvador
it
is that
down.
we have specialized hospitals. We have one
Okay.
that's a pediatric
All right.
hospital,
Okay, bye.
another
Bye.
one that specializes in pregnant women, and another one that specializes in adults with other conditions. This allowed us to invite the hospital authorities to also get involved in any kind of research, either to understand the manifestations of the illness, use of drugs, but one of the important requirements for pregnant women was that all of the accompaniment from conducting the research and then accompaniment and monitoring and establishing other variables beyond what was expected for COVID. And we had to bring in perinatologists who are the specialists and this subspecialty of obstetrics had to be present. And this has yielded good results because the subspecialists have not only reviewed the protocol, but have also proposed some variables that are of interest to the perinatologist, and therefore they are monitoring the women with this condition during pregnancy. Thank you.
Gracias, Mario. Ana, Marta,
Thank
no
you,
sé si
Mario.
ustedes quieren agregar
Ana and
algo
Marta, would you
sobre
like to
este
add
punto.
anything on this point? No, we really have not had any studies with pregnant women. No, we
Bien.
haven't had any either.
Bueno,
says
entonces
Marta.
tal vez
All
esto
right, then,
refleja esta tendencia a excluir mujeres embarazadas de la investigación, ¿no? Y tal como lo mencionaba Javier hace un rato, hay intervenciones que ya se utilizan en mujeres embarazadas como la hidroxicloroquina para la malaria, el opinavir-ritonavir para VIH, el remdesivir se probó en mujeres embarazadas también para el ébola. Entonces, creo que sobre estas preguntas y algo que ya mencionamos antes, la reflexión final es de que la justificación científica de la exclusión de ciertos grupos debe preguntarse si es que no está en el protocolo de investigación a los
we need to
investigadores
ask
principales
this.
como miembros
We need to ask
del
the
Comité de
principal
Ética.
investigators
Y bueno, les agradezco
why they are
muchísimo su
excluding certain
participación el
groups. I
día de
thank you
hoy.
very much
Los
for
voy
your
a dejar con
participation
Carla
today.
para
I'm going to leave
alguna
you with
reflexión
Carla
final tal vez y el
for
cierre
some final
de
thoughts
este quinto diálogo.
and to close
Muchísimas
out
gracias por
this
acompañarnos.
5th session of our dialogue. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you, Javier, Mario, Marta, and Ana. This has been a very rich discussion that has touched on many central issues of research ethics. For us, it is particularly valuable to see how, while all of you come from different countries, from different regulatory systems, and with different arrangements, countries with one type of organization, some with a federal or non-federal research ethics committees, I think that we have found some strategies that are common to all of us. I think that all of you have emphasized certain things at different times in your participation. This is a new way of doing work, and it entails extensive communication, communication with the ethics committees, communication with the health authorities, communication with the researchers, and communication with other experts and other entities that handle these issues in a specialized way within our countries. So a couple of thoughts come to mind. One is that if we found so many great ways to do our work within the context of a pandemic, then maybe we should think about which of these new forms of work that we've discovered during the emergency should stay with us after the emergency is over and should be part of the new way in which we work on research ethics.
Pandemic has shaken all of us. It has made us question things that we thought inconceivable. For instance, for me working for PAHO from home, something as simple as that. Now, that's the way things are being done. So I think that although we have found many solutions during this emergency, we need to make sure that the lessons learned and that have helped us find solutions be used for through things, for non-emergency situations, for instance, for future emergency situations. How can we start thinking about this dialogue, and how do we address these lessons learned? We may want to call them learned, but maybe they're not learned. We may still need to learn from them. And so in many health emergencies, we have to keep that in mind. There's a lot of topics that we discussed at the very outbreak of Zika. If you recall, in our region, Ética was the home for the last health global emergency we had. And many institutions with whom we battled at that time don't even talk about it. Nobody says now, since it's an emergency, I'm not going to do any ethical review. That is over. And nobody now says that the ethical review processes are unmovable, or everybody realizes now that you have to adjust situations to emergencies. So we have made a lot of progress, but for us at PAHO, we have a commitment that precedes the pandemic. The 2018 document of PAHO that was signed by all member states, assessing where we stand in the area of bioethics and what are the things that still have to be done. And in there, we have made a commitment to move forward from what we learned in Ebola, in ethics, and improve our ethical preparation for another pandemic. That's something that we had been working on before, but the challenge presented today, it's almost like a immersion course. We were studying it from afar, and now we've had to jump right into the pool and deal with it. we now have to continue listening to see how different areas, different committees have addressed certain problems, certain issues, and see how, as a region, we can come up with some sort of summary to indicate what were the things that improved and we should adopt for the future. In all the committees and all the national authorities, in all the research teams, there's been steps they've had to undo. We've taken a step forward and then we've realized, oh, that doesn't work as well as we thought. And in some cases, maybe we haven't taken the steps that have been taken in other areas or have been taken more quickly than we have. So since this is the next to last session in this series of dialogues, which, as I said at the very beginning, we're going to try to take into account all the views of the authorities, committees, researchers, patients, all have, because I think everybody has something to contribute. But since this is the next to last one, the penultimate, what I'm going to ask that if you had any suggestions for a topic that we haven't yet discussed, something that you've just thought of that you think could improve the way we can address research at the global or local way to make it ethical during an emergency, a health emergency, please let us know. As you know, PAHO has created a lot of guidance for the ethics in COVID research, but we always have that commitment that when this is all over, we're going to have to review all of that from a critical perspective in the light of your experiences and implementing that guidance that we've received and looking to see what's left, what shouldn't be included, what things didn't we think of. You, from your different perspectives, are in a unique position to contribute to this regional learning effort. The last dialogue will be the one where we scratch our heads and say, okay, now what are we going to do? But I know you have a lot of ideas, and I don't want to wait until the next session, which is on December 9th. Yes, 9th of December. It's not going to be a Tuesday because of the holiday. And I want to invite you to submit some ideas which you think our panelists should explore or should bring up for thought. Please send them to us. Send them to the email of the PAHO Regional Bioethics Program. And if you are not already on the list of ethical research, please subscribe to that list, because many of the questions you've asked, many of the examples that have been given are based on the clinical vaccine trials. And if you recall, we had an ethics workshop that focused on the vaccine trials for COVID-19, and some of the issues addressed, because there's some vaccines that now have been demonstrated to be efficacious and safe. And what does that mean in terms of your obligations to your study participants? Should placebo or not? Should we give it to everyone? Those issues have already been addressed, and there is a recording of it on the webpage of our seminar. But I did bring this up because PAHO, and I could see that it was commented on in the chat and through some questions. PAHO is creating, the World Health Organization, excuse me, is producing a much more specific guidance on that topic. Will come out this week, and we will distribute it through that ethical research list. So again, thank you so much. Please send us your suggestions. We had some very creative ideas, but there's still a lot of room for improvement and for coming up with other ideas. And please join the list so that we can share all of these resources with you. And I see that some other colleagues have shared resources as well. They can be shared in the chat. So we're here ready to continue to support you once again. Thank you, Javier, Mario, Ana, Marta, Sara. Thank you to our interpreters who have allowed us to get closer to our colleagues who speak only English. And again, thank you to our support team who makes all of this possible. Thank you again, and have a good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you, and congratulations for having initiated this. Whoops.